me the grass is much greener.
Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome back to another countdown. So ever since watching As Told by Gingear, I knew at some point I was gonna make lists on all the seasons. There's just so much interesting stuff to tackle. There are very few shows quite like As Told by Gingear in terms of how it goes about world building and its continuity, with characters growing and changing appearance at a very slow and subtle rate, and them wearing different clothes and just not always having the same outfit. Things like this are not standard, even today in children's animated television. And yet, As Told by Gingear kind of pioneered more continuity-based animated kids' cartoons in many other ways, with how it goes about showcasing many of its overarching stories within and narratives within episodic plots, and just different character arcs in general. Also, the show really dives into topics and life experiences older kids and teens can relate to, which Hey Arnold did to an extent, but it doesn't go anywhere near as far, which I've said in the past. This is another thing that makes the show unique, but also makes it a bit of a pioneer in children's animation, in a similar way Doug and Hey Arnold are, for just inspiring more slice-of-life shows, and even other kinds of kids' animated series, to not be afraid to tackle complex or tricky topics that can appeal directly to kids and teens that might be perceived to be too complex or even inappropriate for kids to handle. I was planning on making more individual episode reviews after the Of Lice and Friends one, and make lists on the show eventually, but didn't want to make them until I finished all my Hey Arnold lists. Because even though the shows are very different, I do in many ways consider this to be a spiritual successor to Hey Arnold. But I wrapped those lists up quicker than I expected, so here we are. Season 1 is such a fascinating season for all the reasons I mentioned. It really does tackle some interesting topics involving being a teenager and dealing with changing feelings towards your circumstances and puberty, and just how complex and turbulent all that is. And the season does a great job introducing us to this world and how the show operates. This should make for a great season, but it really doesn't. Look, the season is decent overall. I enjoyed more here than I didn't, and there are some very strong outings I'll talk about next time, which use how bold and different the show was, and I guess still is, to its fullest advantage. But this season has a lot of problems that persist even in its best episodes. The biggest one being that despite the season covering some truly interesting topics that other animated shows at the time aimed at kids were afraid to, it doesn't always get particularly great stories out of them, leading to some episodes being pretty underwritten, not allowing the show to go as far exploring these topics either. This season also has a problem with pacing and balancing the Ginger and Carl stories. The Carl and Hoodsie plots can be a nice light addition to break up a more serious Ginger story, but sometimes, even when they're pretty decent, they break up the pacing of a good Ginger story in a really awkward and bad way. And this is much worse when the Carl and Hoodsie plots are either really bland or really stupid, which an amount of them are. Also, and this is a problem that is considerably smaller than the last two, but this season just isn't very funny. It has its moments, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely one of the season's weakest elements. While an amount of the season was just decent to middle of the road, there did end up being 5 episodes I consider to be bad, and those are the ones I want to talk about today for being the worst of the season. So with all that said, here is my list of the top 5 worst As Told by Gingear Season 1 episodes. Hey, would you look at that? This one did end up making my worst list. When I talked about this episode a few months ago, back in my classic Nicktoons worst Halloween episodes list, I said I didn't like it, but privately outside of that, I really didn't expect this to be on my season 1 worst list, once I got around to making it. But as it turns out, there were only 5 episodes I considered to be bad, so this inevitably had to land on the list. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, as I have talked about it before before and did honestly say most of what I wanted to in that Halloween video, and my opinions are exactly the same. I will reiterate that this episode is not that bad, and is definitely the lowest on this list for that reason. There are some good scenes and moments that do capture the feeling and experience of being in a middle school production, and also how it feels like to be a teen in an awkward situation with administrators at your school, especially when you didn't do anything wrong. And seeing how the different adults respond to the situation of Ginger being framed, and just how they act towards Ginger is also really interesting. This show just nails expressing these dynamics and feelings around teen middle school situations. The setup to this episode is also pretty solid, and there are some funny jokes for what it's worth. But this episode has one of the weakest stories of the season. So little actually happens. The stuff that does feels really generic, and they just don't get that much out of Ginger being in this play. And while the ending scene is cool, and I love the allusions to the Crucible in the show, and with Ginger's story, and how they merge all of that into the final scene, they just don't do that much with this either. And all that stinks, but the worst part of this episode is still Carl and Hoodsy's plot. This is a slice of life show with some cartoony elements, obviously, but it's still pretty down to earth. That's the show's appeal, and what it is going for in majority of episodes. So any supernatural elements are doomed to fail from the get-go, but Carl just summoning a ghost of a character who died in a previous episode is so dumb and doesn't fit this kind of series at all, especially with there being no buts or ifs about if this is actually what really happened, with her talking to Lois and giving Ginger evidence that plays into Ginger's story. Carl literally summoned a ghost. He brought someone back from the dead. Even in Hey Arnold and Doug, shows that would be more likely to do something like this would at least toy around with the idea of the ghosts not being there, which you can debate if that's a good or bad thing or not either, but no. In the middle of this down-to-earth series, ghosts can just be summoned. It wouldn't even be that bad if they at least had more fun with Maud being back, but they really don't. She and Carl just talk a little bit, and then gives Ginger evidence to prove her innocence. What a dumb, unfitting story for the show that they don't even really do much with. And that, more than anything else, is what pushed an honestly kind of middle-of-the-road to mediocre episode right onto this list. I think what makes this whole story ever so slightly worse is I was never really a fan of Maud to begin with. Speaking of... This is going to be my hottest take on the list, and maybe even for the entire show. I know this episode and Maud as a character are fan favorites, and I can see why. But man, I just don't like this episode at all. I didn't watching it the first time, and rewatching it for this list, my opinion has not changed. It didn't get worse by any means, and this episode isn't that bad, but it definitely didn't get any better. Look, this episode has some pluses that do really bring it up a lot. Ginger and Courtney's story is great. Their dynamic, especially early in the season, is so fascinating. The rich and fabulous Courtney being interested in the middle class, average in her eyes Ginger because of her status in that role, while Ginger wants to be friends with Courtney because she also finds her interesting for being so rich and seemingly perfect, but more so because she thinks it will make her middle school and high school life better by getting in with someone as popular and as rich as Courtney. Is just such an interesting dynamic. It's so weird because of how different these two are and the reasons they want to be friends, but because they also kind of click and get along, just makes it even more fascinating and fun to watch. And while other episodes around this one do a much better job exploring this weird dynamic and this blossoming, if not difficult and complicated friendship, this one still gets some really interesting and wonderful beautifully awkward scenes out of Courtney visiting Ginger's home to see how someone like Ginger lives, and just being so clueless and stuck up, but seemingly acting in such good faith and trying to make a good effort to be nice to Ginger and just hang out with her. It's really funny and fascinating to see these two trying to connect in this weird situation, with them just being so different. But that is, sadly, such a small part of this episode, to what is undoubtedly the A-plot of this thing, the Carl and Maude plot, which just isn't very good. I know many people find Maude and her dynamic with Carl cute and charming, but I just don't. I honestly find it kinda weird. This lady is insane and super unhinged, and while I can see why Carl would be drawn to her as they share an interest in many things, I always kinda get the feeling Carl shouldn't be hanging out with this random weird old lady. But that's a pretty minor problem. The bigger problem is they just don't do that much interesting stuff with this dynamic. The two are weird together and pull some honestly kinda dull and forgettable pranks, and then there's a whole love/friendship triangle part of the story with Hoodsy getting jealous, which is just so eye-roll worthy and doesn't really go anywhere, and then Carl actually falls in love with her and invites her over to his house where he plans to marry her. All well, there's just a ton of weird jokes about the possibility of them being in a relationship, or I guess Lois misinterpreting that as what's actually happening, which all just falls completely flat. None of the relationship illusion jokes work, and at the house, all of the actions that Maude take, being really weird and rude, also just aren't funny at all and just kind of annoying. I was really hoping this episode would use Maude being weird at the dinner to explore more about Ginger and Courtney's relationship, or add more of a weird challenge to making Ginger be a good host, which they kind of do, but outside of one or two moments, that doesn't really happen. Ginger is embarrassed and Courtney thinks it's kind of funny. And as it stands, all of Maude's weird antics and the dumb stuff surrounding how Carl feels about Maude and his conflict with Hoodsy just takes away time that could have gone to Ginger's story. Because every time that starts to get a little interesting, the episode spends so much time on all of Carl's stuff, which isn't, killing the pacing completely, ruining this episode. And the ending is just so strange. Look, I applaud the show for being ambitious and having a named character die in the second episode in front of a lot of our main characters, but it just doesn't work here. This episode is so silly up until this point, so you're not really able to take this death super seriously. It's just super out of place and somber for honestly kind of no reason, so I don't really care, and neither does anyone else in the episode other than Carl. We don't even get to see that much of how this affects him. So for a moment that should feel big and impactful, it just doesn't. It doesn't really even impact that much of the rest of the series, besides maybe a couple one-off lines and that one time she comes back as a ghost. It just feels like they had a character die for the sake of having a bold ending. After how good and serious this show starts out in its first episode, it really sucks that the very next episode really doesn't take itself seriously at all, undermines the good overarching story elements, and butchers an ending that could have been really impactful and interesting, but instead is just a character dying for no reason because why the hell not? Bold move. Once again, there are positives that bring this thing up. It is not the worst episode by any means, but to me, it's a really overrated dud that more than belongs on this list. So interestingly enough, this episode was one of my favorites of season 1, watching it the first time. I thought both stories were fun, and I thought it was kinda cool exploring these characters around this awkward middle school dance. On rewatch though, I realized this is one of the least substantive episodes of the show. I know I've complained about the plots of some of the season 1 episodes not being particularly great, even when the show has an interesting issue to cover, but this episode takes the cake for having basically no story, at least on Ginger's end. Most of the episode is just different characters talking about what they want to do for this dance or what they're planning on doing, and then later in the episode, Courtney's letter to Will accidentally goes to Darren, and we get a miscommunication story between him and Ginger, which is just so dumb. And Darren's response to Ginger feels super out of character. I know he is over the moon to be asked by Courtney to go out to the dance, but I don't think he would immediately assume Ginger is lying to him because she's jealous. But then it really doesn't matter because 5 seconds later, he figures out she was telling the truth and the episode ends. That's pretty much all that happens. Look, if this episode had no plot and was just showing off experiences around this awkward middle school dance in an interesting way, and really tapped in to how it feels like to be in a situation like this with getting ready for a middle school dance and then actually going to it, that would be fine. But this episode really doesn't do that. This isn't a case of interesting theme, scenario, or issue covered that's ruined by a bad story. It's an episode that actually has really nothing interesting to say about our characters or their current situation that also has a bad story. There are a few select moments that kind of capture what it's like to be a teen in this situation in a compelling way, but they're pretty rare. This episode really could have used an awkward school dance to create a great story that develops and explores our characters more, but instead we get a nothing of an episode with an incredibly weak story that, when it isn't generic and forced, is just really boring. And the same goes for the Carl and Hoodsie plot, which also has to be one of the most boring of the season. At first I thought it was kind of fun. Having them team up with Blake to save an animal they care about sounds like a fun story, with Carl and Hoodsie having great motivation. But the problem is that there's really no complications at all. They make a plan to steal this heart and everything goes successfully. There's no twists and turns, so once again, it's just bland and boring, like everything else in this episode. The reason this episode isn't any higher is because of the good moments I mentioned, despite how dull this one is, and I can't not mention that the Hoodsie and Macy stuff is super cute. The scenes with them are great, and a big plus in this episode's favor. Because of these things, despite how poor this episode is, we still have 2 more to go. So this is another episode that shrunk on me a lot watching it again, although this one I wasn't super positive on to begin with. And it stinks, because this episode has a really good setup. Courtney and Macy, seemingly polar opposites, being put in a high school class together is such a fun idea and character pairing the show could do a lot of fun stuff with, and we do get some funny moments out of it. But then instead we get this story of Macy throwing a pool party she was pressured into throwing even though she doesn't want to, and then Ginger and friends trying to prevent these older high school girls from throwing a mean and humiliating prank on Courtney, and that's it. Now, this could be a fun story if there was consistent conflict and maybe some twists to make the episode exciting, or if there was really strong stakes, but the episode doesn't really have either of these things. A good portion of this episode is a semi-boring scene in the classroom where not a lot of interesting stuff happens, and then the girls planning on how they're gonna help Courtney not get humiliated by this prank. It's a lot of setup to a final conflict, which would be fine, but the stakes just aren't there. These girls say they're gonna make sure Macy's life is miserable if she tells anyone about their plan, but then she tells Ginger and Dodie and they help Courtney out, so it really doesn't matter. And for Courtney, it's said that her reputation will be ruined if they don't save her, but like, would it actually be? Look, obviously, it would be really embarrassing, especially for a young teen in front of their peers. And credit where credit's due, I did not expect a Nickelodeon show, even a more mature one like this, to have 2 girls plan on removing another's bikini top and then it actually happening. Nobody sees anything, obviously, thanks to Ginger and friends coming in for the save, but this would be mortifying for any teen. But I'm just not really sure if this did happen to Courtney without her getting saved, if her reputation specifically would have really been ruined. If it was any of our other main characters, maybe, but Courtney is so popular and has such control of her image that I have a really hard time buying into at this point in the series that this would stick in any meaningful way. More likely, the two girls would just get in trouble for taking advantage of a middle schooler. Also, because of how on top of everything Ginger and friends are in this episode, I never believe these mean girls' plan is actually going to succeed in any way, which makes me not super invested in this story. So this episode is once again just a boring chore to sit through. Carl's plot is equally dull. They're doing a science project where they need DNA, so they collect gross samples at a pool party. That's it. I have nothing else to say. It just adds nothing to an already forgettable episode. The reason this episode isn't number one is because while it is really bland, I at least respect this kid's show for showcasing such an awkward and uncomfortable situation, even if they really get nothing out of it and have nothing to say about it. But on a much bigger note, this episode, weirdly enough, does have some of the funniest moments and gags of the season. No, seriously, there are some truly hilarious, laugh-out-loud moments in a show that honestly doesn't produce a lot of them that often. There aren't a ton of jokes, but the ones there are mostly really work. It sucks that for a show that usually isn't that funny, one of the season's worst actually is. So its successes in that area is why it only landed here. Still a pretty bad episode, though. But before we get into what I consider to be the worst episode of the season, here are 4 dishonorable mentions. None of these episodes are bad, but I decided, since the season is only 18 episodes, that on each list I'll cover what episodes would be on the top and bottom half of an episode ranking. If I were to rank all these episodes, you could consider these episodes 10 through 13 in no particular order, when it comes to where the episodes are ranked in the season. This episode is not bad by any means. My previous review is not a lie at all. And it is on the higher end of okay, as I said last time. So I'm not going to say anything about this episode because I said my piece on it in its own review you should check out. But I will add that this episode, if I were to do a ranking of the season, would be number 10, meaning it was one hair away from landing in the best episodes video. I just want that fact to be known. Sadly for it though, its problems are just bad enough for it to end up here. This is another episode I was really drawn to the first time I watched it, but on rewatch it shrunk on me a bit. Unlike A Piece of My Heart, I just find this one really middle of the road. I do like the setup. We get some fun character pairings, and this episode shows off what it's like to be a teen getting paired up with their crush in a class in a true-to-life and semi-interesting way. There's some funny moments centered around the drama of the pairing of Ginger and Ian, and while I was conflicted at first, I do like Darren's portrayal here. I like how, as a friend, he kind of struggles with ruining Ginger's parade, but eventually can't help it, and reveals that Ian is using her for a good grade. But this episode doesn't do a whole lot with this story or these character pairings. And Ian is a super bland character, making his relationship with Ginger not that interesting and making this episode another forgettable one. I actually really like Carl and Hoodsy's plot here, but they don't end up going that far with that one either. And while I like the final scene of Ginger getting back at Ian for using her and their heart-to-heart, I just don't really believe Ian means anything he says, because I've been given little reason to, and I wouldn't really know either way because he's so bland. Once again, just a middle-of-the-road episode in a season that has much worse, but also much better outings. Hey, it's the last one I've talked about before. Unlike the other ones, I did want to expand my thoughts on this one because it is a really interesting episode. The setup is really good, with Ginger figuring out that she has a grandfather who is Jewish and wanting that to be a part of her identity because it's technically part of her heritage. And she is a teenager trying to find her own identity. And her trying to respect that new part of her and her usual traditions of Christmas at the same time isn't a horrible plot idea. And it's pretty bold bold to have a kid show episode in the early 2000s talk about PC culture. But this episode really botches its messaging and story, and really at the end of the day just has nothing to say about the topic. The message is you shouldn't get too wrapped up and over the top in trying to make everything equal and represented when it comes to religious representation, and that's fine, but it's just a very simple message with not a lot of teeth behind it, because Gingear, and I guess Dodie to an extent, don't do good jobs representing people trying to abide by PC culture. This episode just goes so over the top with both their actions, to at least on Ginger's end to an extent, I have a hard time believing that she would act like this, and it makes her feel more like a caricature of PC moral authorities than an actual character believably trying to be more PC. And on Dodie's end, while her actions are more believable, this is just once again not a great representation of most people or teens specifically trying to be PC, even in bigger ways than they should. This just isn't a great or compelling portrayal of any sort of issue. A lot of this episode is just Gingear overworking and being extra to make everything at her holiday party be equal, and Dodie being an overdramatic drama queen about stuff that really isn't happening or really isn't like that big. Once again, this is in character for her, but just isn't a great representation of the issue tackled. Both these things make this episode dull, and while all of this makes me want to call this one bad for how much it botches its story and messaging, the Carl plot is great. I really love everything about it. It's so cool to get a really serious Carl story in this season, and I love how the episode slowly builds up to revealing why Carl doesn't believe in Santa Claus, and then showing his strained feelings about his father, and then that amazing scene where he talks to his dad, and we really get to see who he really is and the kind of relationship, or lack thereof, the two of them have, really proving why Carl feels the way he does. It's so revealing and does a great job representing a relationship between a kid and a distant parent, who might not be a bad guy and on some level cares for Carl, but is a total flake and a loser, which is so complex for a kid show. I'll talk more about Jonas in season 2 and in the best list because I just have a lot of thoughts about his role in the show and his characterization and just how complex of a character he is, and also just his relationship with his kids, which continues to be explored as both of them grow throughout the series. But yeah, this story is great, and I love everything about it once again, but it's just not that big of a part of the episode. Either way, it is enough to bring up such a boring, unthoughtful mess, which is why the episode is just okay and not bad. So I know at one point it was kind of a hot take to dislike this episode, but after the Were in Between podcast came out, which is fabulous by the way, and a wonderful companion piece to the series, I listened to it when I first watched the show, and it was such a good way to get the fullest experience out of it. If you have seen the show, but somehow have not listened to this amazing podcast, go do that right now. Anyways, when Patricia said she didn't like this episode, I think it became a bit more of a common take and less of a hot one. I should say that I don't hate this episode by any means, but I think it's a mediocre hour-long special, and stands in stark contrast to the other three. Look, the premise is good, and I like the setup to all the stories, and I think this episode does a decent job portraying the summer camp experience and what the kinds of people who attend are like. I never went to summer camp though, so I can't really relate, but I do know going to one is an experience that many people have and is a very common experience for kids and teens. But this episode honestly just suffers from the most weak story writing and bad pacing, especially for being such a long special. Carl's plot should be really good. He has a great motivation for doing what he's doing, but it plays out in such a formulaic and slow way. They never do enough to convince you the principal is the dog napper. You know from a mile away it's going to be a misunderstanding, but they still spend such a long time building up to him being exposed, and then they randomly stumble upon the actual dog napper, and we don't even get to see them catch her. It's revealed next season they did, but it's like, what's the point? The story just ends, and they catch her off screen after all of that, and we don't even learn what she did to Monster, which was half the point of the story? Stupid. And the stuff on Ginger's end at camp just also isn't that great. Having Courtney be in this camp that the other girls love and are familiar with, while being stuck up in uncompromisingly Courtney, could be fun and lead to some great scenes, especially after a season of developing her and Ginger's dynamic. But they don't really do much with it. Courtney is just kinda stuck up and whiny, and while Ginger is kind of annoyed, she mostly just ignores Courtney, which is really weird. Look, Courtney is annoying and rude at points in this episode, but an amount of the time, especially early on, she really isn't that bad. And Ginger, right from the get-go, is actually really rude and dismissive of her, and pretends she's not even there, which is super out of character. Like, aren't they supposed to be friends? And the episode doesn't make any point out of this. And while she does acknowledge Courtney at some points to justifiably get annoyed at her for being whiny and stuck up when she is, for the most part she doesn't seem to care about Courtney being there at all, one way or the other. This makes it so the episode really doesn't get a lot out of Courtney being there, which is made worse by the fact she gets a lot of screen time, and a lot of it is just her complaining, which isn't interesting. The only purpose she serves is to give the wrong impression to Sasha about Ginger. And speaking of Sasha, his plot with Ginger is terrible. He's a super bland, shallow character who assumes other people are shallow based on stuff he heard other people say, that he's not even sure they're dynamic with the people they're talking about, and the entire thing is about Ginger struggling to figure out if she really wants to be with Sasha, and I just don't care, because Sasha sucks. And this episode really just has nothing interesting to say about how Ginger is feeling. She's into him, and then she wants to be with him, and then she's mad at him for justifiable reasons, and then because Sasha's sister, who's honestly just a mouthpiece for this story, tells her to get together with her brother, she decides that that is what she wants. It's not compelling, and the messaging around it is annoying. The story, at least at that point, wasn't about being afraid to express how you really feel to someone, because Ginger, for the most part, was decently upfront with Sasha the whole episode. She wasn't hiding her feelings from him at that point because she was debating how she felt, but because she was mad at him for being an ass. So the whole ending of them getting together doesn't work. And I'm sorry, but Copper Colored Ponies is a bland and forgettable song. I do enjoy some stuff here. The stuff with Darren and Miranda is good. They're an interesting pairing, and their story is compelling, even if it's a smaller part of the episode and it doesn't get enough time to play out. I also like seeing some of the goals the girls have and how stuff surrounding them pops up at random times in the story to make this episode more fun and exciting and really make it feel like the girls have been there for a while and gone through at least some growth. We don't get to see a lot surrounding that, sadly, but it is a good part of the episode. And I do think the climax with the girls harboring Darren and Miranda is fun, and it was the first time all episode I was actually pretty invested in the story. But all that is pretty minor, and this is still a pretty lackluster episode overall, and was very close to making the list proper. You can consider this my honorary number 6. But with all that said, let's finish this list and finally get into my... So I know this episode being number 1 is pretty surprising, because I believe this episode is generally well liked, but I'm sorry. This was always gonna be my number 1, for the simple reason that this is the episode this season I just get the least out of watching. Once again, like the other episodes on this list, the concept for this episode is good and the setup is also solid. I like how the beginning of the episode captures the feeling of being that age and being excited for a snow day, but also the anxiety around getting such a crazy amount of snow and the governor calling a state emergency. I grew up in Minnesota, so this was an experience I could relate to. But they just don't do anything with the fun snow day setup. Majority of this episode is either Courtney and Blake fighting or the kids being nervous. It's really boring and repetitive, and I know I've said that for most of the episodes on this list, but this one really takes the cake. None of these scenes or jokes work. It's not fun or funny watching Blake and Courtney fight over and over again and just be spoiled brats and treat Winston badly. It's in character for them to do this, but what do I as an audience member get out of watching it if it isn't funny or entertaining at all? And that's a big chunk of this episode. The rest of the episode is Ginger and friends being nervous at Ginger's house, which also isn't interesting because even with everything that happens, the episode never convinces me they're in any sort of danger. And the episode could have used the story to show an interesting set of scenes with maybe them being optimistic at first, but one character, let's say Dodie, slowly gets more paranoid and slowly makes the other girls really nervous, building great tension and anxiety throughout the episode, leading to a great freakout scene at the end. But instead, they're all just kinda nervous and complaining in some pretty unfunny and awkward scenes, leading to an unmemorable, not very earned, I guess, freakout scene at the end. And that's really it. That's all the episode has to offer. Nothing about this episode is entertaining or funny. Even the ending with Courtney chasing down the truck, like it should be really funny, but it just isn't. Other story beats they add, like Ginger, Macy, and Dodie's project about a survivor they decide to do on the Gripplings, doesn't really play into the episode at all and is forgettable. Carl's plot isn't the worst, but it is just a boring story of them trying to catch pigeons. And while I kind of like his scene with Blake near the end, the fake out dog death is super dumb. We obviously see that the dog is alive, and he obviously comes back at the end of the episode. And because of these reasons, Carl's story ends up going nowhere as well. I really have nothing else to say about this episode. It's just the least enjoyable episode of the season with the least amount of redeeming qualities. Other episodes at least have some great jokes or scenes that bring the episode up or tap into something in a more interesting way, even if they don't get a great story out of a topic. This one just doesn't do any of that. And with how repetitive and dull this episode is, it's just such a chore to sit through, and because of all of that, it is my least favorite episode of As Told by Gingear Season 1. And with that, the list is done. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more videos similar to this in the future. Also, leave me a comment down below of what you thought of my list and what your own would have been. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Stay tuned for the top 5 best As Told by Gingear Season 1 episodes coming soon, but until then, this has been Chocolate Guy, signing off.